Hi BookTube, and welcome to another fiction review. In addition to my TBR list, my alphabet soup list, which you've probably heard me talk about in previous videos, I've also been trying, in a more casual way, to introduce into my reading books I already own that are bigger, over 450 pages, because it is a big investment of time to plunge into one of those longer books. And sometimes that investment pays off greatly. Sometimes. Today we are reviewing Labyrinth by author Kate Mosse, published in 2005. It is the first of a series, book 1 of 3. However, it's important to note that the only similarity between the books in the series is the setting, and I believe a couple of the characters maybe, but it isn't guaranteed. So it is not a continuous story about the same thing. It is simply 3 stories which all take place in the same area and are all paranormal thrillers. So imagine the Da Vinci Code meets Daphne du Maurier's The House on the Strand, if you wanted some idea of what is Labyrinth. And I had a paperback that's been sitting on my shelves for some considerable time. So I put it on my read what I own big books list, thinking, okay, let's hit this. We bought it way back. Can't remember when I bought this book. I do remember why. Kate Mosse was one of the founders of the Orange Prize for Fiction, which is a UK award for novels written by women. And I knew about the Orange Prize because I used to subscribe to a magazine called Mslexia, which was aimed at women writers. Mslexia held annual poetry and short fiction competitions, and Kate Mosse often served as a judge. So I must have had that name in mind when I was browsing for secondhand books, saw this title, and thought, oh yeah, I've heard of this because it's been really popular. Let's try a Kate Mosse. The author was born in 1961 and grew up in West Sussex, which is in the south of England. She went to New College, Oxford, got her BA in English. I believe that was an honours degree as well. Worked in publishing after graduation, including the big publishing houses Hodder and Stoughton and Random House. 1992 saw her first published work, which was non-fiction, Becoming a Mother. She then shifted gradually to writing contemporary fiction, and contemporary fiction with a suspense element. Labyrinth was the first book in what is now called the Languedoc trilogy, and it was a best-selling title in the UK in 2006. In fact, there was a television miniseries based on Labyrinth that was produced in 2012. It aired in the UK, in Canada, South Korea, Portugal, Poland, and Sweden. Interesting selection of countries. Has anybody watched the miniseries out there who's watching this video? I didn't catch it. If you have, I'd be interested in your opinion, not only on what it was like, but how did you manage the double storyline, which we're now going to go on and talk about. So going on to structure, let's talk about this dual storyline. What unites both stories within this novel is the region in which they are set. Labyrinth is set in the south of France. I'm going to show you a map now. And in particular, it centers on the city of Carcassonne. Kate Mosse has a home in Carcassonne, and medieval specialists know that this region, which is also known as the Languedoc, was politically and culturally distinct from the northern part of France at one time. In the south, a dialect called Occitan was spoken, and the government was centered in Toulouse, and the hereditary counts of Toulouse ruled over the region. I'm told that culturally there was a greater tolerance extended to Jews and Muslims than in other Catholic French regions. This may have been linked to religious ideas which seemed to influence the area from the 11th century until the middle of the 12th. Various labels were used to describe these beliefs. Apparently, local people referred to those who followed them as good Christians, and that was presumably to stress some positive differences when comparing them with practicing Catholics. However, Catholic authorities did not agree, and I understand do not agree now, whether the group that they called the Albigensians or the Cathars were or were not Christians. Now, to split the story, part of the novel begins in 1209, and that was a critical year for the Cathar faith. In 1208, the Pope offered complete forgiveness of sins to any followers who would participate in a crusade against the Albigenses or Cathars, and a series of bloody battles followed, beginning with the siege of Béziers in 1209. The Languedoc region was destabilized and eventually taken over by northern French nobility. The Spanish Inquisition was founded at this time, and one of its purposes was to completely eliminate Cathar belief from the region. So in the first storyline in Labyrinth, the reader is going to follow a noble family living in Carcassonne during this time, in particular a young woman named Allais. The second storyline is set in 2005. These two stories are interleaved. You will read, say, 2 to 3 chapters based in the 1209 story, then skip over and come back to 2005 for a couple of chapters, back to 1209 for a couple of chapters, back to 2005, and so on throughout the length of the novel. What's also important to know about both storylines is that they focus on the importance of the mythical Holy Grail, although both storylines treat it as something that may actually exist. Now, I'm no expert, but after a little research online, I'm given to understand that medieval scholars do not believe there is any connection between the Cathars and what they believed and legends about the Holy Grail. That this connection is a myth that is developed in more modern times. If that is the case, then Kate Mosse is treating the modern myth as reality for the purposes of this novel. In Labyrinth, the Cathars elect a very small group of people who are responsible for guarding the Holy Grail and related ritual objects, and some of these people are also trained in the correct way to perform certain rituals to achieve certain ends which come from powers given by the Grail. The narrative viewpoint throughout the novel is third person, but you are mainly focused on 2 female characters. In the 1209 storyline, as I've mentioned, there is a young woman named Allais. In the 2005 story, there is a young woman named Alice. And yes, there is a connection between these two. The point of the novel is for the reader to learn gradually what Allais will become and what Alice Tanner will discover that she is, and this discovery will establish this very important connection between the 2 women and effectively unite those 2 storylines. Regarding the narrative style, Kate Mosse does have a talent for writing popular prose, and by that I mean her prose is very easy to read, and it's easy to get through pages quickly, more quickly than you might think, so that a very long book doesn't feel like a very long book. It feels more pleasurable and far, far less work. It is the same kind of prose that I could not, and maybe other people could not read all the time, and there are a couple of reasons that come to my mind. One, that kind of prose seems to feel that every noun needs to be preceded by at least 1 adjective, and better by 2, as if nouns were somehow naked without them. Verbs need to have adverbs. I feel in writing that isn't necessary, so it's a kind of writing I can read and read easily, but it gets to me after a bit, so that I couldn't read popular prose books, lots of them in succession. And also eye color. Eye color is this thing that is always focused on when describing a new character. And I want to ask everybody, just a general question, does anybody really notice eye color? And when I mean notice beyond the sort of, are they brown or not brown? Because that to me is the only distinction I ever make. But do you ever go to the point of looking at someone's eyes and getting a specific word for the color, like chestnut or cerulean? But in this case too, there is unusual eye colors noticed. And I don't think I've seen anyone with hazel eyes with gold flecks in them and really notice that quality. But there you go. Please feel free to comment, because I would be willing to change my opinion if I got enough evidence. That's no problem. If you really like the writing of Ken Follett, say, then I think you're going to find Kate Mosse's books very similar, very easy to digest, and feeling very pleasurable, even though they are very long. One thing, though, to bear in mind, and this is with regard to number of characters, it isn't just Alice and Allais that are two characters connected across several centuries. A number of other characters in both the 13th century storyline and the 2005 storyline, they connect. They're like equivalents of each other, and you start to spot them and identify them. But regarding the number of characters as a whole, I did a head count so that you don't have to. In the 13th century storyline, there are 36 characters, and in the 2005 storyline, there are 21. So that's, 57 altogether. And some of those are only mentioned once, so you don't quite know when you meet them whether they're going to be important or not. And so I did find it difficult to remember, because there were so many people introduced to me, that when I began to realize that a certain minor character was of some importance to the plot, I couldn't quite remember who they were, and sometimes had to go back and find where they first were introduced and go, oh yeah, so that person is related in that sort of way. So if you do like the premise of the story as I've described it so far, I would take some notes while you read if you think you're going to have trouble keeping track of that many characters. And regarding mobility, well, the thriller element that is in both storylines means a fair amount of movement. You know, good guys are being hunted down by bad guys, or good guys are trying to get to a significant location before the bad guys get there to prevent something bad happening. You know, as you can imagine, the pace of that movement is slower in the 13th century, and the 13th century storyline actually covers a number of years, whereas the 2005 storyline is a matter of days. So that's how much modern life is speeded up, and yet, you know, can take the equivalent amount, roughly, of page space. Regarding representation, the novel does highlight this Cathar reputation for being more tolerant of Jews and Muslims that were living in the Languedoc region. There is a significant Jewish character who seems to have taken on Cathar beliefs. I don't know how realistic that scenario would actually be. You also learn a small number of Occitan words, and it was interesting for me because the only two languages other than English that I ever spent any time learning were French and Spanish, and Occitan seems like a language where where Spanish and French kind of bleed into each other and affect each other. Problematic content. Well, if you caught the words thriller and bloody battles in what we've said previously, you're going to be asking, I think, how much violence is there exactly, and how well described is it? I say not that much, but there are going to be scenes, because this is about the persecution of a group that's considered heretical. There are going to be public punishments like hanging and burning. So some people might find that disturbing, but those scenes aren't frequent, and when they do occur, they could be skim read without losing any real plot points. In fact, the plot point that happens does get repeated, so you get the information later on. You could pick up and go, okay, I see what happened. Here we are, let's carry on. And you could miss out those bits if you found them particularly disturbing. There are a couple of erotically charged scenes. Those are set back in the 13th century storyline. Kate Mosse is the kind of writer who takes you up to the point where clothing is going to be removed and then skips forward to the point where clothing is being put back on. So I think some people will be able to tell from that whether they can deal with the erotic material in this novel. And just like if you've read Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code, Jesuits are the baddies in both storylines. They want to capture and destroy all the Grail paraphernalia, and they're carrying on their 13th century mission of heresy elimination right into the 21st century. Rabbit hole. I start my rabbit hole with a spoiler alert. Yeah, sorry. If you came to this review because you really are thinking, ooh, Labyrinth sounds like my kind of book, I think I will read it, and so you don't want any plot details given away, then you're good. You're free to go watch a different video right now, because this rabbit hole does talk about details. But for those of you who've stayed, I'd like to read you a quotation from the very end of the novel. And the viewpoint character is Alice Tanner, and she's the protagonist of the 2005 storyline. And she says, as the book is coming to a close, she also understands, as Allais did, that the real Grail lies in the love handed down from generation to generation the words spoken by father to son, mother to daughter. The truth lies all about us. So the true Grail is love, full stop. And I could really go with that. It's an idea I could run with. And I expect plenty of satisfied readers will just read over those sentences on page 691 and they won't be at all bothered. You may be one of those readers. The Goodreads ratings for Labyrinth, they split 50-50. In other words, 56% of readers gave the book 4 or 5 stars and 44% gave it 3 stars or less. That's almost even. And that's always an interesting thing to me, because that means this book either hits you one way or hits you another. So let's talk about it. I didn't sample any of the reviews, so I don't know what it was that made the 50-50 split. Kate Mosse does have that hypnotic writing style, as I've mentioned before. It can make 50 pages go by like you've just read 5. She maintains pace, she maintains tension, and the plot twists are all backgrounded by the romance of southern France at the time of the troubadours. It's lovely. If that's all you want from a novel is just a romantic adventure, then you could easily give Labyrinth 5 stars. It does pull that off. And I'm reminded of the 2 weeks that I spent back in 2012 reading the Twilight Saga. Okay, all 4 books. I read them in less than 2 weeks. I read it for fun. I read it because I had a young relative who adored those books but couldn't convince anyone else in her family to read them. I didn't bring any expectations. I just thought, you know what? I'm just going to read without questioning. I'm just going to open myself up, surrender to the story, because I figured that's probably what my young relative had done. And I had an amazing time. However, I don't think I could reread the books and relive that experience, okay? Rereading is always different. Rereading always brings another part of your brain to the story. And I bet that if I'd not read them in 2012, but if I'd read them, say, in 2024, right now, when I'd had this channel, well, I think the rabbit hole for the Twilight series would cover similar ground that I'm going to cover with Labyrinth. Some popular fiction is best read without thinking, yeah? Without questioning. Put that part of your mind away, surrender to the experience, have your consciousness altered by that hypnotic prose style, and just lose track of time and the things happening around you and be entertained. If you don't do that with Labyrinth, if you bring your critical faculties to the reading of the book, then I think that magic consciousness-altering spell, it won't be quite as effective. It'll be less powerful. Maybe you will ask the same questions I did. And here's some of the questions that I asked. Why does the Grail need to be kept hidden? Why does it require human protectors? Because that's what happens in Labyrinth. And in particular, there is one protector who is gifted extraordinarily long life, like Methuselah, centuries and centuries of life. And the purpose of this elongated existence is to protect the Grail and the associated ritual objects and the knowledge of the rituals which gift the longer life, okay? And that's the scenario that Labyrinth asks its readers to accept. And that this is still going on, that in the 21st century there is still someone alive who was alive in the 13th century, and the whole purpose of their remaining alive, being given this life by the power that comes from the Holy Grail, is to protect the Holy Grail and to protect the knowledge that would lead to giving that elongated life, right? It also asks them to believe that the protector is ensuring that the blood descendants of other faithful protectors is managed. That is, the children are eventually taught what their parents know, and apparently they accept this strange reality and a strange responsibility that comes with it automatically. Personally, I was willing to run with that idea if I assumed that the Grail, whatever it really was somehow fragile, a vulnerable thing, something that if you smashed, the world would end. And yes, that sounds far-fetched, but I mean the whole idea of 900-year-old humans protecting the Grail and making sure that repeated generations who were descended from other protectors are made aware that they have to carry the burden of their ancestors, well, that's already pretty far-fetched. But the Grail in the Labyrinth is not some universe-ending grenade in the shape of a cup or something else. The Grail is never seen, never described, although it is highly desired. Why is it highly desired? Because it can give long life. And why does it grant long life? Well, it seems that the only reason it grants long life is to protect itself against the kind of people that desire long life for other reasons. Okay, are you following this so far? So for the sake of good entertainment, I still would have winked at this little tangle of contradictions. I wanted to see the Grail, I just wanted to know, what is it exactly? What does it look like? And because I suspected that it must do something more than just make somebody live longer. And it does. There are 2 occasions in the novel, one in each storyline, where the baddies find the hiding place, some caves in the mountains near the French-Spanish border. They acquire the books of ritual knowledge and the other objects. And so, of course, they get themselves into those caves and they start doing the rituals so they can summon up the power of the Holy Grail. Of course they do. And the protectors are there also. But what do? Well, they're only humans, so the baddies either knock them on the head or tie them up or point a loaded gun at their rib cage, so they don't do much actual protecting. The Grail, when push comes to shove, is completely unprotected. Now, on both these occasions, the Grail proves that not only does it have the power to grant longer life, but it's far better at protecting itself and at destroying its enemies than these human protectors. And once it has dealt with its enemies, it quiets down. It is no more threat to human existence than that. So I don't know about anybody else, but when I finished the novel, I felt deflated. Why did the Grail even need to exist? Its whole purpose for existing seemed to be just to preserve the fact that it exists. Why did humans need to concern themselves at all with it, whatever it was? Because it never appeared, so I never really knew what it was, except that I came to page 691, and one of the main characters tells me the real Grail lies in the love handed down from generation to generation, words spoken from father to son, from mother to daughter. The truth lies all about us. Seriously? I read 700 pages of constant tension and jeopardy, the loss of loved ones by violent means because they sacrificed themselves for this Grail, lots of worrying about the whereabouts of 2 old musty books, and then the Grail is just what? It's just love handed down from generation to generation. Can you see what I mean? I mean that hypnotic, exciting, paranormal thriller, it just kind of fell flat on its face at the end. I just thought, none of this was necessary. None of this needed to have happened either in the 13th century or in 2005. And I was left with a little bit of cynicism because I knew that this book came out 2 years after Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code, which I did read, and I found for entertainment purposes, don't take it too seriously. It's perfectly fine. Perfectly fine. But this book, less so. So anyway, that is the review done. Make of this book what you will. If it still sounds good to you, go ahead and read it, because it's not that I didn't find it enjoyable. It's just that maybe I brought the wrong part of my brain to a book that said, don't think, just sit back and enjoy. And maybe that's what I should have done. Middlemarch meditation next weekend, everybody. We get started on chapter 31. In the meantime, have good reading, everybody, and get lost in those books and take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.